If I had to pick one word to describe the Heisenberg, meaty would be the first to mind. It's not the biggest streamer out there, but it packs a lot of bulk into a tempting profile that's too much for big trout and bass to resist. From a tying perspective, the surprisingly few materials and repeated techniques on this pattern make it a great one for those tying their first articulated streamer. There are two hooks on the Heisenberg, a size 8 and a size 6. We'll start with the smaller size 8 hook for the back half of this fly, and set the 6 aside for when we build a bulkier head section. Tie in your thread just behind the hook eye and begin laying a thread base down to where the hook starts to bend. Grab your olive marabou and hold it towards the tip of the feather to form a tail section. Measure this tail so it's about a hook shank in length, then lay it down where you ended your thread base and tie it in. Make a few open wraps back to behind the hook eye and lay the rest of the marabou feather down along the shank, giving it a twist to wrap up loose fibers. Tie off here and snip the excess, then bring your thread back down to the tail. Next we'll add a bit of flash. Grab 2 strands of the material, line them up next to each other, and locate the strand's midpoint. Tie the midpoint in parallel to the shank just in front of your marabou tail. Then bring the front-facing strand backwards and tie in again so that all 4 strands face rearwards. You can manipulate the strands so that they're evenly spaced on both sides of the tail before locking in. Cut all 4 strands so that they are even with the marabou tail. Pink cactus chenille will serve as the body material for this fly. Cut an 8 or 10 inch long strand and tie in one of the ends around the middle of the hook shank. Bring your thread back to the tail again, continuing to tie the chenille as you go. Let the chenille hang back out of the way for now. Now grab 2 schlappen feathers, an olive and a white. We'll wrap this hackle up towards the head, but we'll do it with both feathers at the same time. I like to prepare mine by lining the 2 materials up as even as you can and parting the strands at the tip in the same spot. This ensures that the length of the 2 strands will be about equal as they move up towards the hook eye. Tie in the parted sections of the 2 feathers right where you stopped your bobbin. Then go back to your chenille and start bringing it forwards and touching wraps. Stop wrapping when you've reached about an eye length back from the front of the hook, tie off, and cut the chenille's excess. You should have plenty of material left over for another hook. Follow the chenille with your 2 schlappen feathers by holding and wrapping them together. Do 3 to 4 open turns with the materials, pulling out any trapped fibers along the way. Once you've made it to where you've ended your chenille, tie off and cut again. Hold the schlappen back with your non-bobbin hand and make some wraps rearward to angle all fibers towards the tail. You can also pluck out any fibers that stick out at weird angles. The last addition to our tail section are some rubber legs. Pull off 2 strands from the assortment in your kit and tie them in one at a time. I like to wrap the midpoint of each leg around my thread, bring my bobbin up into a wrap, and slide the leg down into position before making a few turns to lock down. This helps me aim the leg into position and prevents the materials from slipping around. You want the rubber legs to extend a bit past the marabou tail and flash, so you may not even have to cut them at all. However, if there's a few strands that seem out of place, you can always slightly trim them so they're even. The fish probably don't care either way. Now grab your whip finishing tool and make a few turns where you tied off your materials. Cut your excess and apply head cement to lock everything down. This concludes the back portion of our Heisenberg. Put this finished product aside for now and go to your size 6 hook for the front of the fly. Tie your thread in again behind the hook eye and keep wrapping until you're about a third of the way down the shank. This front section will be weighted with a pair of dumbbell eyes. Size them up so that the tie-in point is about the full length of the eyes, then make a few turns over the eyes in both directions to leverage them into place. I use 2 techniques to really secure my eyes. The first involves making wraps over the eyes and under the hook shank to lock in the eyes from above. Here's a top-down view of this process. Again, I'm going over the eyes and under the shank. The second move is bringing the thread under the eyes and over the shank to close this mechanism from below. As I wrap, you'll start to see the top wraps I made being further tightened down from underneath. Here's a top-down view of this motion. Do both of these wraps several times until a small thread dam begins to build up. Then bring your thread back behind the dumbbell eyes. Apply a small drop of head cement to the eye wraps. Continue building your thread base down the hook shank, this time extending out to the apex of the hook bend. Then bring your bobbin back up to the shank's midpoint and open wraps. We lengthened our thread base in order to tie in the material that makes this fly all come together, the articulation wire. Take a pair of wire cutters and snip off a 4 or 5 inch long section. Lay the wire down near the middle of your hook shank, leaving about an inch of tag facing towards the eye. Tie the rear facing wire down against the shank, and keep wrapping until you're down on the bend of the hook. This wire is super grippy and should hold well against the shank in your thread turns, but it's still important that you make this connection as secure as possible. Poorly secured wire can pull out, and you could be at risk of breaking your fly in half on a snag or losing a big fish pinned on the back hook. With the wire in place, grab a pair of orange plastic beads. Thread the beads onto the rear facing wire and push them up against the bend of the hook. Now grab your finished back section from earlier. Slide the wire into the back section's hook eye, bring it around, and double it back through both orange beads. Work the beads in back section down the wire so that they all rest against each other with little to no gap. There will be plenty of movement between the hooks, and the beads will still prevent the fly from fouling on itself. Bring the folded back tag wire down on top of the shank, and start wrapping forwards again until you reach your original front-facing tag. With both tags even, grab them and fold them back so that they now face towards the tail. Snip your excess at the hook bend. Then take a series of tight wraps over the whole area, covering the wire and thread. When you're confident in your wire covering wraps, bring your bobbin above them and brush on a layer of super glue. The glue plus the tight turn should be plenty to hold this articulation mechanism in place. The body of this front section will be very similar to how the back section was tied. However, there's a difference in how we tie in our marabou. We need a longer tail of sorts that tapers the bulk we add in the front and covers our beads on all sides of the shank. To do this, we'll tie in our marabou at the tip and palmer it forwards. Tie in the feather's tip where the front hook starts to bend, then advance your thread up to the middle of the shank. Make turns with the marabou and continue to brush out any trapped fibers the best you can. When the back of the shank and articulation areas are well covered, tie off and snip your excess. Like you did with your schlappen earlier, brush all of the marabou fibers backward and take wraps to push them back towards the tail. The result should be a long, full, multi-layered tail section. The rest of the body almost up to the dumbbell eyes will be tied in the same exact way as the back hook. Add in flash behind the marabou tail, chenille wraps around the shank, double olive and white schlappen turns, and 2 pairs of rubber links up to this point. Leave about a hook eye's width of open thread behind the dumbbell eyes. Now we'll add some serious bulk in the way of mixed olive dubbing. This stuff is made up of pretty long strands, so the best ways I've found to tie it in involve aligning as many of the strands as possible. Do this by lightly pulling apart small clumps and reattaching them as the strands lengthen, ensuring that you're not breaking any strands apart. Directly behind the dumbbell eyes, tie one of these clumps in at its midpoint, then fold the front-facing section over itself and tie in again. Invert the hook and repeat this process with the second clump on the underside of the fly. You'll want to add some dubbing right on top of the dumbbell eyes as well. It's tricky to tie in clumps in the same way we just did on this section, so I like to throw a couple pieces of dubbing into a small dubbing loop. Form the loop by lengthening your thread, folding it around your finger, and closing this fold off by wrapping backwards on top of it. Advance your thread to in front of the dumbbell eyes. Load a few light clumps of straightened dubbing into this loop, ensuring they all stay in line. Then hook the bottom of the loop onto a spinner or some hackle pliers and turn to create a small wispy core. You can also hit this spun loop with a bit of Velcro to tease out strands and prevent the dubbing from matting. Wet your fingers and brush the strands all to one side. Then begin wrapping behind the eyes, over and under the eyes, and finally just in front, before tying off and snipping your excess. Go back in with your scissors and Velcro to pull out any stray fibers and clear the dumbbell eyes. You can also push and wrap some of the dubbing back to open up the shank in front of the eyes. Grab 2 more clumps of olive dubbing and repeat the same process you did behind the dumbbell eyes by tying in, folding over, and wrapping back, on top and below the shank. Shorten up your thread and cover any exposed dubbing clump to taper the head down towards the front. The thread dam here can be thick, but make sure you don't crowd the hook eye. With dubbing in place, go back to your whip finisher and make turns just behind the hook eye. Close off the knot and snip your excess. Cover behind the hook eye in head cement. Take one more go around with your scissors to taper the body of the streamer. You want your dubbing bulk to extend to around where your palmered marabou ends, so not really much past the front hook. Go slowly during this process. You can't add any more material at this point, so it's better to snip in small increments to prevent ruining past work. After a quick haircut, your Heisenberg is ready to fish. This is a killer pattern for all sorts of fish eaters in the trout world and warm water. As the fall weather picks up, this fly should get plenty of attention from predators looking to stock up for the winter. Thanks for watching.